This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. What you're about to hear is the story of a man born into bondage who became one of the most celebrated figures in the history of Arabic literature. Antarah ibn Shaddad was a 6th century warrior, poet, and lover, a man who spent his life fighting not just enemies on the battlefield, but a world determined to define him by his origins. Across 5 chapters, we'll explore his remarkable journey from enslaved outcast to legendary hero, the forbidden love that drove his greatest verse, and the extraordinary myth that outlasted him by 15 centuries. Chapter 1. Born into Bondage, Bearing Noble Blood. Somewhere in the highlands of Najd, in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, around the year 525 of the Common Era, a child came into the world under a sky that cared nothing for human hierarchies. He was born dark-skinned, strong-boned, and utterly inconvenient to the social order that surrounded him. His name was Antarah, a word whose roots the Arabic tradition has never fully settled. It may have meant valorous or valiant. It may have been onomatopoeic, derived from the buzzing sound of a blowfly. Or it may have come from a word for the thrust of a spear, a coincidental aptness that no one who later watched him fight would have missed. Whatever the etymology, the name would eventually become one of the most celebrated in the entire history of Arabic literature. And yet, when he drew his first breath, none of that mattered. What mattered, in that fiercely hierarchical world of tribal Arabia, was who his mother was. And his mother was a slave. Antarah's father was a man named Shaddad al-Absi, or so the dominant tradition holds. Some scholarly accounts introduce a small qualification, suggesting that the Shaddad in question may have been a grandfather or paternal uncle rather than a direct father, the precise relationship blurred across 2 centuries of oral transmission before it was ever written down. What all traditions agree on is that the connection was to a man of genuine standing, a warrior of renown who served under the tribal chief Zuhair. The Banu Abs were not a peripheral group. They were a respected and feared force in the tribal politics of northern and central Arabia, known especially for their warriors and their horses. Shaddad's acknowledgement carried weight, and his lineage meant something when spoken aloud in the councils of his people. But Shaddad had a complication. During a raid on the kingdom of Aksum, the ancient Ethiopian civilization that stretched across the Horn of Africa, he had taken a captive woman. Her name, as the Arabs knew her, was Zabiba, a word that means raisin, a reference to her dark complexion. Some traditions hold that she was not simply a captive, but an Ethiopian princess, a woman of her own noble blood, stripped of her status the moment she was taken as a slave. Whatever her origins precisely, she was brought back to Shaddad's household as his property, and she did not arrive alone. Zabiba came already a mother, with sons of her own, boys named Jadis and Shaibub, and in time she bore Shaddad a son as well. That son was Antarah. Shaddad's household was not a welcoming place for this child. The customs of Jahiliyyah Arabia gave Shaddad a convenient mechanism for delay. A man was not required to acknowledge a child born to a slave woman unless that child had distinguished themselves sufficiently to make the recognition defensible in the eyes of his peers. The bar was designed to be high, and the system created no urgency to clear it sooner than absolutely necessary. Shaddad made full use of that latitude. He also had a wife named Sumaya, whose response to Antarah's existence was considerably less ambiguous than her husband's. Where Shaddad's attitude was one of prolonged delay and avoidance, Sumaya became an active source of hostility, an antagonist within the household itself.
Antarah grew up not merely without his father's formal recognition, but with a stepmother's enmity, adding pressure from another direction to a situation already designed to diminish him. The rules of Jahiliyyah Arabia were brutally clear on the central point. A child born to a free Arab man and a slave woman did not automatically inherit the father's status. Slave status passed through the mother. If your mother was enslaved, you were enslaved, regardless of who your father was. This was not a rule that existed in obscurity or was subject to interpretation. It was the organizing logic of the social world Antarah entered. And so Antarah, despite being the biological son of a respected warrior, despite carrying Shaddad's blood in his veins, and sharing enough of his father's features that the paternity was, according to the sources, fairly obvious to anyone paying attention, was classified as a slave. What this meant in practical terms was not merely a legal designation. It shaped every dimension of his existence. He was assigned tasks appropriate to his station, which meant herding livestock, tending flocks, performing the kind of labor that placed you firmly at the bottom of the social ladder. While the free sons of the Banu Abs would have been learning the arts of mounted warfare, practicing with spears and swords, being prepared for their future roles as warriors and tribal leaders, Antarah was out in the rocky highlands of Nud, watching over goats and camels. The sources describe him spending his formative years in this way, immersed in the landscape of the desert, exposed to its heat and silence and occasional violence. There was also the matter of his appearance. Antarah was dark-skinned, visibly so, in a way that immediately announced his mixed heritage to everyone around him. The Arabic literary tradition applied a specific designation to 3 celebrated Arabs of dark complexion with African heritage on one side of their family. He was one of the Aghriba al-Arab, a phrase that translates as the Arab crows. The term carried meaning in pre-Islamic poetry. Ravens and crows appeared in Arabian verse as birds associated with separation and ill omen, creatures that announced departures and foretold misfortune. There was poetry in the label, but there was also condescension embedded in it. Darkness of skin in Jahiliyyah Arabia was associated with lower status, with servility, with otherness. For Antarah, his complexion was not simply a physical characteristic. It was a social marker that confirmed and reinforced his enslaved condition at every glance. That Antarah would become the exemplary figure of the Arabic tradition of Furusiyya, the art and ideal of the mounted warrior, a concept scholars have traced through the Iberian Peninsula into the European ideal of chivalry, with chevalier and caballero both translating the same essential meaning of the man on horseback, gives his origin in servitude an additional dimension that is worth pausing on. At the root of what the medieval West would call the chivalric code stands a man who was born a slave. There is a medieval Arabic text known as the Book of Songs, a vast compilation of literary history composed in Baghdad several centuries after Antarah's death, which preserves a number of details about his early life. Among these is the detail that Antarah was born with a cleft lip, an additional physical difference that would have made him stand out even further in a world that placed enormous weight on physical appearance and the impression one made in public. The same text confirms that his mother Zabiba had other enslaved children in the household, Shaibub among them, and this places her situation in sharper relief. She was a woman with no freedom, no protection beyond what her circumstances afforded, raising children in conditions of servitude within a household that contained its own hostility. And yet Shaddad's household, complicated as it was, allowed Antarah some proximity to his father's world, even as it denied him membership in it. He grew up watching the warriors of the Banu Abs, absorbing the oral traditions of his tribe. The Book of Songs suggests that he received his education in poetry by eavesdropping on elders reciting verse around campfires, taking in by ear what he was never formally taught. And alongside that informal education, he was observing the social codes of the Banu Abs with the sharp eye of someone who had to understand those codes without being permitted to fully live by them. Learning what honor meant to these people, what a man had to do and say and be in order to earn respect in this particular corner of Arabia. What Antarah was doing with all those hours in the desert, alone with the livestock, was not simply enduring his situation. The sources describe him developing physical abilities that were genuinely remarkable. Enormously strong, quick, and coordinated, he began demonstrating capacities that went far beyond what anyone might have expected of a slave boy watching goats. The Romance tradition preserves an early story about a slave named Daji, owned by Prince Shas, who was found bullying an old woman when the young Antarah intervened. Daji did not survive the encounter. The episode brought Antarah to the direct attention of King Zohair, the tribal chief, and it announced at an early age a quality that would define him throughout his life: an instinct to place himself between the defenseless and those who would exploit them, regardless of the personal cost. Another story from the same tradition preserves a scene in which Zohair threw a piece of meat to the boy, only to have a dog bolt with it before he could catch it. With mighty leaps he bounded after the animal, swifter, the romance insists, than an eagle stooping upon its prey. With a mighty spring he caught it, seized its jaws, and tore them asunder down to the beast's shoulders, recovering what was his from the ruins of the creature. The king was reportedly left speechless. Even allowing for the embellishments that inevitably accumulate around legendary figures over time, such stories are telling us something real about the impression this child made on people who encountered him. By the time he was 10, according to the traditions, he killed a wolf that threatened the animals he was guarding, and brought the evidence of his kill back to his mother. There is something deeply uncomfortable about the world these stories illuminate. Shaddad knew Antarah was his son. The sources are clear on this. The resemblance was evident, the parentage an open secret within the tribe. And yet for years, Shaddad declined to formally acknowledge his child. The system had given him every reason to wait, and waiting cost him nothing, while it cost his son everything. A child born into slavery had to prove their worth before their father's name was made available to them. The proof would have to be extraordinary. It would have to arrive on terms the father could not refuse.
Faced with this, Antarah neither quietly accepted what the system demanded, nor openly defied it in ways that would have been futile. The frustration of his position found early expression in verse that circulated among the tribe, a voice whose full significance belongs to a later part of this story. And in other, more immediate ways, his pride was already asserting itself in conduct the people around him could not fail to observe. This was the posture of someone preparing, quietly and patiently, for a moment that had not yet arrived, but that he understood would eventually come. The Banu Abs were a tribe living at the edge of constant conflict, surrounded by enemies, dependent on warriors of genuine quality to survive. And quality in warfare has a way of making itself known regardless of the social categories people try to impose on it. The formal designation of slave and the lived reality of who Antarah actually was had come to exist in a tension so extreme that something eventually had to give. What would actually take to cross from one side of that divide to the other? The answer would come not through politics or persuasion, but through the one thing that pre-Islamic Arabia valued above almost everything else. It would come through blood, and through battle, and through a moment on a battlefield when his father would finally have to choose between his pride and his tribe's survival.
Chapter 2. A Declaration Under Fire.
The moment came without warning, as the most decisive moments usually do. Sometime in the second half of the 6th century, while Antarah ibn Shaddad was still legally classified as a slave and therefore denied full participation in the warrior life of his tribe, a force from the Tay tribe descended on the lands of the Banu Abs. The shape of the crisis is consistent across all traditions that preserve it. Armed men came for the tribe. The women needed protecting. The warriors needed to answer. And suddenly, in the chaos of an incoming assault, the entire apparatus of social hierarchy that had held Antarah in place began to crack under the weight of raw necessity. Shaddad al-Absi turned to his son and issued an order: fight with the warriors.
It must have seemed obvious in the urgency of the situation. He knew what his son was capable of. Everyone in the Banu Abs had seen enough of Antarah by this point to understand that he was, physically and in terms of pure martial instinct, among the most formidable young men the tribe possessed. Calling on him in a crisis must have seemed like deploying the most capable tool when the situation demanded it. Simple, direct, necessary. What came back was not what he expected. Antarah replied, in words that have been preserved across more than 14 centuries of transmission, that the slave does not know how to invade or how to defend, but is only good for milking goats and serving his masters.
Shaddad pushed again. One tradition records him repeating his demand in different terms: charge upon the enemy. Antarah's answer held exactly what the first had held. He was enslaved. He would do what slaves do. Only when the same position had been stated and refused and stated again did Shaddad issue the declaration that transformed both their lives: then charge as a free man. These are not the words of a coward, and to read them that way is to miss everything important about the moment. A boy who had already proven his physical courage many times over was not afraid of an enemy force bearing down on his people. The words were not a refusal to fight. They were a legal argument delivered at the most inconvenient possible moment for the man who most needed to hear it. Nor was it an improvised argument. In the years before this moment, Antarah had already been making his position felt through action, refusing to accept the slave's portion of battle spoils that the system set aside for those of lower status. The sources add a sharper detail to this refusal. He had also declined to accumulate what would eventually have been necessary to purchase his own freedom. He would not buy his way out of servitude through patient accumulation. He would not accept any partial accommodation the system offered, not the degraded share, not the slow exit. He would take what was owed to a man of genuine quality, or he would take nothing. By the time the Tay raiders came, he had spent considerable time making clear, through categorical refusal at every available point, exactly what kind of recognition he was waiting for. The crisis did not create the strategy. It supplied the occasion.
What Antarah was doing in that exchange was holding a mirror to the system that had constrained him, forcing his father to confront the logical absurdity at its own heart. If I am nothing more than a slave, here is what a slave can offer you. If you want what I am actually capable of, you know what it will cost. That cost, demanded twice over before Shaddad finally spoke, was the recognition of something the social order had tried for years to deny. Contemporary scholarship has noted the Hegelian quality of this structure with some precision. The crisis Antarah engineered maps on to what philosophers of recognition theory describe as the point at which a master is forced to acknowledge the full personhood of the one he has treated as an instrument, not through moral growth, but because his own survival requires it. The battle made that logic undeniable. Shaddad could not deploy Antarah as a tool without first recognizing him as a self.
The exact phrasing of the declaration shifts across traditions in ways that are worth naming. Some sources record it as a conditional grant: defend your tribe and you are free. Others, including the version preserved in the Al-Alfi tradition, deliver an imperative rather than a bargain: then charge as a free man, but understood as the endpoint of a longer sequence in which Shaddad first issued the command to fight, Antarah refused on grounds of his enslaved status, Shaddad issued the command again in different terms, Antarah held his position a second time, and only then did the declaration arrive. The conditional formulation sounds like an arrangement struck between two calculating parties. The imperative formulation, understood as the conclusion of that full sequence of refusals, sounds like something older and less negotiated, a command and a release delivered in the same breath, as though the repetition had forced an answer that could not be unsaid. What no version of the exchange ever wavers on is the substance. A life changed direction completely in those words. It is worth understanding precisely what those words meant in the legal and social terms of Jahiliyyah Arabia, because the gap between the declaration and the transformation was not gradual. Under the customs of the time, what Shaddad was performing was formal manumission, a binding declaration with immediate and concrete consequences. Antarah now had the right to bear arms as a warrior, to receive a full warrior's share of any spoils taken in battle, to speak in tribal councils as someone whose opinion carried the weight of membership, and to pursue marriage within the tribe. None of these rights were vague. Each one had a specific social mechanism that, until that moment, had excluded him entirely. The spoils division he had previously refused rather than accept at a slave's rate was now something he could claim at a warrior's rate. The council debates he had observed from the margins were now debates in which his voice had standing. And the marriage negotiations that had been categorically unavailable to him, not merely unlikely but structurally impossible under his prior status, were now a territory he could enter. These rights did not operate independently. They formed a single interconnected fabric, and it was the whole of the fabric that opened at once. And then he went and fought. By every account that has survived, he fought extraordinarily well. The sources do not preserve the kind of tactical detail that would allow a precise reconstruction of the engagement, but they are consistent in what they emphasize. His conduct was decisive at the moments that mattered, the sort of performance that could not be explained away or quietly set aside in the aftermath. He was fighting in full possession of his freedom for the first time in his life, and everything that years of exclusion had failed to diminish in him was available without restriction. The accounts describe a man who was where the fighting was hardest, who turned the engagement at the points where turning it was necessary, who demonstrated in the space of that single battle what the exchange had been about. The invaders were turned back. The tribe was saved. The effect on the Banu Abs was immediate and visible. In the aftermath of that battle, Antarah received his warrior's share of the spoils, the concrete, material confirmation that his status had changed. He took his place in councils. His voice, which had always possessed a poet's precision and a warrior's directness, now carried the right to be heard in the full register of a free man's authority. The poetry he had been composing for years began to circulate differently, carrying the additional weight of acknowledged identity rather than the ambiguous status of a man who was something the social order had no proper category for. The timing of his freedom placed him at the center of something much larger than his personal story. Some accounts link the Thai invasion to the very beginning of what the Arabic historical tradition calls the War of Dahis and Al-Habra, treating the attack on the Banu Abs not as a separate episode preceding the war, but as the event that triggered it. Other traditions present these as sequential rather than causally connected. What all sources agree on is that his freedom and the years of intensive warfare arrived together, and it was the campaigns that followed which would give his reputation as a warrior its full shape and scope. What the moment at the Thai assault ultimately demonstrates is the structural logic of how recognition operates under pressure. Systems that deny personhood do not tend to reform gradually in conditions of comfort. They crack at the specific points where the denial becomes too expensive to maintain, where the cost of sustaining the fiction finally exceeds the cost of abandoning it. The crisis did not persuade Shaddad of anything. It removed the option of remaining unpersuaded. That is a different kind of change, and the distinction matters for understanding what kind of freedom Antarah had actually received. Not the gift of a conscience that had reconsidered, but the concession of a system that had run out of room. With it, the world opened. What his freedom had conferred was not arrival, but access, the legal foundation for pursuing what had previously been structurally prohibited. Whether that access could be converted into what he actually wanted from it was a question whose answer would require years of effort the battlefield had only begun to prepare him for.
Chapter 3. A Love Forbidden by Birth. Her name appears in the very first line of the most celebrated poem in pre-Islamic Arabic literature. Before the battles, before the descriptions of horses and armor and desert campaigns, before anything else, there is the image of an empty dwelling and the man who cannot stop returning to it. The Muwallaka of Antarah ibn Shaddad opens with a question addressed directly to a place where his beloved once lived. O house of Abla, situated at Jiwa, talk with me about those who resided in you. Good morning to you, O house of Abla, and be safe from ruin. It is a greeting offered to a ruin, a conversation started with silence, and the desperate tenderness of it tells you everything important about what Abla meant to the man who wrote those words. Abla bint Malik was Antarah's cousin. Her father Malik was the brother of Shaddad, which made her and Antarah the children of two brothers, a relationship that in 6th century Arabia carried no inherent prohibition on marriage. Cousin marriage was not only accepted in that world, but was in many contexts preferred, a way of keeping wealth and alliances within family structures. The opposition to a union between Antarah and Abla was therefore not rooted in the blood relationship between them. That detail matters considerably because it strips away any ambiguity about the real reason her family refused him. The barrier between them was singular and specific. She was free, and he was the son of a slave. That single fact was the wall his love spent decades failing to climb. The first encounter between them is preserved in the romance of Antar. He came to his uncle's dwelling and found his aunt combing Abla's hair, her black ringlets loose around her shoulders. He was struck with such force that he stood frozen, while inside him, as the romance describes it, his heart beat wildly at the birth of a great passion, and the hot blood burned his dark cheeks. Abla, as soon as she registered his presence, fled. He was left staring at the space where she had been. It is the origin of a love story, in which the beloved is perpetually departing, perpetually at a distance, perpetually on the other side of a boundary that his status creates and recreates in every encounter. There is something almost architectural about how the prohibition functioned in their specific case. Abla's father Malik was Shaddad's brother. This meant that the same man who had spent years refusing to formally acknowledge Antarah as his son was also, indirectly, connected to the father of the woman Antarah loved. The family structure that should have provided warmth and belonging instead produced two separate forms of rejection operating simultaneously. Shaddad declined to claim his son. Malik declined to give his daughter to that son. Antarah was caught in a family web that recognized him on neither side as fully belonging. His poetry from this period does not describe a passion that developed gradually and gently. The language is that of someone ambushed. He writes that he was enamored of her unawares, at a time when I was killing her people. This line from his Muwallaka is extraordinary in its compression. It places the origin of his love inside a moment of tribal conflict, suggesting that his feelings for Abla ignited against a backdrop of war between their respective kin groups. His people and her people were not always on the same side of every conflict, and yet here he was, sword in hand against men connected to her by blood, feeling the first pull of a devotion that would never release him. The irony was total and apparently not lost on him. The poem does not try to resolve it. It simply holds it. What developed from that irony was one of the most distinctive features of his love poetry. He began writing about Abla with a consistency and intensity that had no real parallel in the poetry of his contemporaries. The nasib, the love opening that preceded the main sections of a formal Arabic ode, was a recognized convention with established rules. Describe the beloved, mourn the separation, desire the reunion. But Antarah inhabited this convention with a patience and specificity that set him apart from those who treated it as mere formality.
She appears not just in the Mu'allaka, but across the broader corpus of poems attributed to him. Her eyes compared repeatedly to those of a young gazelle, soft, dark, and arresting. Her smile described with an elaborateness that accumulates through image after image as though no single comparison can contain it. He reaches for the improbable and precise. It was as though the musk bag of a merchant in his case of perfumes preceded her teeth toward you from her mouth. And her mouth is as an ungrazed meadow, whose herbage the rain has guaranteed, in which there is but little dung. These are the detailed, patient observations of a man who has spent an enormous amount of time studying a face he is not supposed to want.
When he described her in terms of such extraordinary value and beauty, he was also positioning himself. Someone capable of this quality of attention, this precise articulation of another person's worth, was not an absurd suitor. The praise of Abla was implicitly a claim about his own character. In the same way that he sometimes took up the battle cry, "I am the half-breed Antarah" on the battlefield, declaring what the social order had meant as a mark of shame and wielding it as a challenge instead, his love poetry was his insistence that what he was could not be contained by what he had been told he was. He stands at an abandoned campsite where she had lived, using the pretext of watering his camels to linger longer than any practical need demands, performing what he calls the want of the lingerer, this ancient ritual of communing with what a place once held. The deer play where people once gathered. The crows call out instead of the voices he had known. The campsite passage belongs to the Qasida tradition, but he inhabited it with a grief that feels immediate and personal rather than merely conventional, pouring out his feeling not to anyone listening, but to the stones themselves, to the empty ground, to the absence that has become a presence for him through sheer force of attention. Consider what his position actually was when he was composing these poems, because the personal stakes were extreme. He was enslaved. For most of his youth, the passion he expressed in verse was all the love he was permitted to have.
Even after he earned his freedom on the battlefield, the path to Abla did not simply open. His emancipation changed his legal status, but could not instantly dissolve the social attitudes that had formed around his origins. Malik remained opposed. He was no longer a slave, but he was a former slave of mixed and complicated heritage. And in the calculus of tribal honor and proper alliance, that history did not vanish the moment Shaddad declared him free. What followed was a series of tests and challenges that the tradition describes Antarah undertaking in pursuit of Malik's permission to marry his daughter. Abla was not simply waiting passively through all of this. The sources record that Antarah counted some of his greatest achievements among those undertaken at her behest, which positions her as something more than an object of longing observed from a distance. She was, in some measure, motivating the effort and shaping the scope of his martial career. The most famous of the challenges involved obtaining a particular type of camel from the Lakhmid kingdom in northern Arabia, then under the authority of al-Nu'man III ibn al-Munthir. This was not a request one simply made and waited for. The Lakhmid court was a sophisticated and powerful entity at the intersection of Arab tribal politics and the broader imperial conflicts swirling around Arabia between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanid Persians. A journey there, a negotiation there, was an undertaking of real difficulty and danger. The challenge was calibrated, whether deliberately or not, to the kind of man who could succeed at it, which was to say, a free man of standing and capability, not someone emerging fresh from servitude. That Antarah attempted it at all tells us what Abla had come to represent. She had become the organizing principle of his claim to full human dignity, the recognition that his freedom and his battlefield excellence had not yet secured. A marriage legitimately won through the proper channels of negotiation and challenge would be the final answer to the world that had tried to define him as less than the people he loved. There is a rock in what is now the Uyud al-Jiwa district of Saudi Arabia that the people of the region have for centuries identified as Antarah's stone, the specific place where he and Abla would meet and where he would speak to her of his feelings directly.
The tradition that locates this physical meeting point in the landscape is a reminder of something important. The love was not merely literary. These were real people navigating real terrain, using what proximity their circumstances allowed, finding the narrow spaces within the rigid social architecture of their world where human feeling could move. The stone is still there, still identified by local memory, a physical artifact from the 6th century that anchors the story in ground rather than legend. Behind the formal poems, shaped for performance and transmission, lay the actual encounters, the glances, the conversations conducted at the edge of what was permitted, the sustained attention of a man who had decided, somewhere in his years of servitude, that this particular woman was worth every difficulty the world could produce.
His poems address her directly in a way that gives the impression of a correspondence conducted in one direction, a series of letters sent to someone who cannot always respond in kind. "She will always remain my dearly beloved," he writes, "even if she should betray my trust, forsake me." But the portrait of Abla as entirely passive in this story is not accurate. The sources record that when Antarah returned to the tribe after a long period of warfare, grimy, thinned by campaign, his armor rusted, Abla disparaged him. She called him worthless. For a man whose poetry had spent years insisting on his worth, that word from the person whose recognition meant most must have landed with particular force. And yet his willingness to absorb it, to commit to the love anyway, is not the naivety of someone who has failed to understand what he is facing. It is the declaration of someone who has already weathered so much loss and exclusion that the additional blow carries no terminal weight. He has nothing left to be afraid of, because the worst has already happened to him.
His uncle's treatment of him forms part of the darker texture of this story. The poem, known as The Eyelids of Maidens, does not merely hint at bitterness toward Abla's father. It delivers an explicit curse. "I wish God would quench my uncle the cup of death bitterly. His hands turn palsied after his fingers were amputated totally. As he sends me to the death, the escape is hardly." This is not controlled sorrow or the guarded frustration of a courtly lover holding his feelings in check. This is a man calling down the death of his uncle while naming precisely what his uncle has been doing, dispatching him on missions calibrated to kill him rather than to genuinely evaluate his worthiness. Antarah understood the politics of his situation with the same tactical clarity he brought to warfare, and his poetry registered the manipulation even while it kept the love intact. He was not a naive suppliant. He was a strategic intelligence trapped in a game whose rules he saw with complete clarity.
What he built out of all of this, the prohibition and the longing and the endless deferral, the occasional glimpse of hope, the public slight and the explicit curse, and the dangerous journeys undertaken at the word of the woman he loved, was something that outlasted every specific obstacle in the story. Whether the marriage actually took place remains a question the historical record does not answer with certainty, and that uncertainty is itself revealing. The love story was so much larger than its outcome. What survives is a record of a man who turned his most fundamental frustration into art precise enough to last 15 centuries, and a woman whose presence, whether as inspiration, as wound, as the face across an unbridgeable social distance, or as the voice that called his worth into question and sent him back to prove her wrong, was never incidental to what he became.
Chapter 4. Not the Sword, the Verse.
There is a line in one of Antarah ibn Shaddad's surviving poems that should stop any reader cold, no matter how far removed from the world that produced it. He is addressing an adversary, someone who has apparently wronged him or underestimated him, and he delivers this warning with complete composure. Like a volcano, he will spew poems that long after his death will find and hold that person up to shame. It is a threat, but it is a poet's threat, not the sword, the verse. And the staggering thing, looking back from where we stand, is that he was right. The poems did survive. They outlasted everyone who mocked him, everyone who doubted him, everyone who looked at the dark-skinned son of a slave woman and calculated that his opinion of himself did not much matter. 15 centuries later, those poems are still in circulation, still studied and quoted and translated and set to music, still shaping the cultural imagination of the Arabic-speaking world, and reaching outward into traditions far beyond it.
To understand how a man became both one of the most feared warriors of his era and one of its most consequential poets requires understanding something about the world those two roles inhabited together. In 6th century Arabia, poetry was not a separate profession that a warrior might take up on the side, the way a modern athlete might dabble in painting or music. It was woven into the fabric of everything. Poetry was how tribes communicated their identity, their grievances, their threats, their alliances. A tribe whose poet was eloquent had a distinct form of power. A warrior who could compose verse had a doubled authority, because his words could do what his weapons could not: circulate beyond the battlefield, survive beyond his own death, reach people who had never seen him fight. The two capacities were not in tension. They amplified each other.
But even within a culture that valued this combination, what Antarah achieved was remarkable for reasons specific to his situation. Most of the celebrated warrior poets of the Jahiliyyah era were men of noble birth, whose social position was secure before they composed their first line. Imru al-Qais, often considered the most celebrated of all pre-Islamic poets, was literally a prince, the scion of a royal house. His poetry had the luxury of operating within a framework of established identity. He was already somebody. The verse was the decoration of a pre-existing authority. Antarah had no such foundation. He was composing poetry from a position of marginality, and his verse therefore had to do work that the poetry of his contemporaries did not. Every poem he created was simultaneously an artistic achievement and a social argument. It was proof, offered line by line, that the categories imposed on him from birth were wrong.
The form he worked in was the qasida, the long ode that represented the highest achievement in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. The qasida was not a casual form. It operated under extremely demanding technical constraints. Each poem maintained a single meter throughout, sometimes extending for many dozens of lines, and every line ended with the same rhyme sound, a discipline of formal consistency that would challenge a poet at the best of times, and was nearly impossible to maintain with genuine artistry over a long poem. The Muwallaka specifically uses al-kamil, the meter Arabic prosodists describe through the footfall pattern mustafilun, mutafilun, mutafilun, a driving rhythm that gives the poem its propulsive forward momentum even across its most extended passages. The form was also conventionally structured in ways that marked transitions between sections toward the main subject of the poem, which might be tribal boasting, warfare, elegy, or the praise of a patron. A poet who could manage all of this while producing verse that felt natural rather than mechanical, that had genuine emotional heat rather than the hollow correctness of someone simply satisfying requirements, was demonstrating something close to virtuosity. Antarah's Muwallaka, his contribution to the legendary collection of 7 hanging odes said to have been displayed at the Kaaba in Mecca, is the poem through which his literary greatness has been most consistently measured. Its opening section, the address to Abla's abandoned dwelling, was touched on in the context of his love for her, but the poem as a whole is a far more complex structure than any single theme can capture. What comes after that opening is something quite different in texture and purpose.
The war section of the Muwallaka is not the generic glorification of violence one might expect. It is a sustained and specific account of how a particular kind of man moves through combat, and it is drenched in self-awareness of a kind that distinguishes it sharply from the boasting verse of less complex poets. He describes charging into battle while the lances are drinking his blood, while bright swords of Indian make are dripping with his blood, and in the same breath confesses that the flashing of those swords reminded him of Abla's teeth. This is not the poetry of someone who has successfully separated the domains of love and war into neat compartments. It is the verse of someone who carries the entirety of himself into every situation, for whom the beloved and the battlefield are not opposites, but components of the same undivided consciousness. There is a specific structural moment in the Mu'allaka that reveals something important about how he understood his own position in the tradition he was working within. He opens the poem with the words, "Have the poets left in the garment a place for a patch to be patched by me?" It is a question addressed to the tradition itself, a poet asking whether the terrain of great verse has been so thoroughly covered by his predecessors that there is anything left for him to say. The question sounds like humility, and there is genuine awareness of tradition in it, but it is also an opening move in a game he intends to win. By raising the question and then proceeding to answer it with the poem that follows, he is asserting his place in the lineage while acknowledging that the assertion requires demonstration. This kind of meta-poetic self-consciousness was unusual in the 6th century. Most poets did not begin their odes with explicit questions about where they stood in relation to what had come before. The sophistication of that self-positioning became the subject of a notable scholarly argument. The medieval critic Ibn Qutayba claimed that the Mu'allaka was Antarah's first long poem, or among his very first sustained efforts beyond brief couplets, implying that his ambitions in the extended form preceded any significant practice of it. Later scholars found this claim very difficult to accept. The poem conforms too precisely to the canonical structure of the Qasida, inhabits its required transitions with too much apparent ease, to be the work of someone still learning the form's demands from the inside. The accumulated mastery on display, structural shifts handled without visible seam, tonal register moving fluently from grief to battle narrative to self-assertion, does not emerge in a first attempt. The debate cuts in a useful direction. What it reveals is that expert readers of the tradition have consistently found the poem too accomplished to be a beginning, which, stated plainly, is another way of saying the poem is extraordinary.
The collection that includes his work was compiled from an oral tradition that was already ancient by the time anyone wrote it down. Pre-Islamic poetry existed first as sound, as performance, as something recited by professional transmitters and memorized by audiences. The poets composed for the ear, and the technical demands of their forms served the needs of memory as much as the requirements of art. Meter and rhyme are not just decorative. They are structural aids that allow verse to be retained and reproduced with accuracy over long chains of transmission. The verse that survived had passed from reciter to reciter across 2 centuries of oral preservation before it was ever written down. That this preservation was imperfect is certain. There are disputed lines, poems of questionable authenticity, later additions that accumulated around the core of what Antarah actually wrote. But the body of verse that emerged from that process was substantial and consistent, around 40 authentic pieces, eventually compiled in his diwan, material that justified the most rigorous scholarly attention. What his poetry communicated to those later readers, and what it communicates still, extended well beyond the personal circumstances of his life. He wrote about his dark skin directly and without apology, in a tradition that had not previously developed a space for that kind of explicit self-representation by someone of African heritage writing within the dominant Arabic literary form. When he declared his mother's descent and described her brow as dark as the black stone of the Kaaba, he was doing something culturally precise. The black stone is the most sacred object at the center of the holiest site in Arabia. To use it as a comparison for his mother's complexion was to claim for her, and by extension for himself, a form of dignity that the social order of his time declined to confer. The image works simultaneously as personal defense and as reversal of the hierarchy that had tried to diminish him. He was not hiding what he was insisting that what he was carried its own worth.
This insistence runs through the martial poetry as well. In one of his most quoted passages, he addresses those who mock him for his dark skin and tells them simply to remember that precious pearls are found in shells. The metaphor is doing several things at once. It validates the beauty inside the dark exterior, but it also makes an implicit point about who does the looking and what they think they see when they examine the outside of a thing. The people who dismissed him based on what he looked like were making the error of the uninformed observer who mistakes the shell for the substance. The poem is not asking for sympathy. It is issuing a correction.
His war songs, a number of which survive alongside the Mu'allaka, have a specific and distinctive energy that separates them from the battle verse of his contemporaries. One of them opens with the injunction to damn the ruins, to stop dwelling on the past, and then immediately pivots into the thick of action. At Al-Faruq we shielded our women, trampled the locusts underfoot when the armies collided. No retreat, we swore. The poem describes the sound of spears as hard iron that makes the enemy whine like dogs at the sight of vipers. There is glee in this kind of verse, a celebration of collective power and swift movement, but it never loses its specific speaker. The voice of the poem is always recognizably Antarah's, marked by his particular combination of fierce pride and strategic self-awareness. He is not simply a warrior recounting events. He is a poet who was also a warrior recounting events, and the difference matters.
Because what distinguished him from those around him was not merely that he could compose verse, a skill that was valued among his contemporaries and not exceptionally rare. It was that he understood his own life as material, that he could observe himself with something like the clarity he might bring to observing an enemy's tactical position, and that he could translate that observation into language precise and durable enough to survive his own death. This is a different kind of intelligence from the one that functions well in battle, though both were clearly present in the same person. The battlefield intelligence processes information quickly, responds to immediate conditions, judges distances and vulnerabilities in real time. The poetic intelligence works more slowly, returns repeatedly to the same material, finds the angle that illuminates rather than the angle that merely records. To possess both, in the degree that Antarah possessed both, was unusual enough that the Arabic tradition eventually formalized the observation in his title, The Complete Knight. There is also something worth noting about the way his poetry functioned within the oral culture of pre-Islamic Arabia while he was actually alive. Poems in that world spread through recitation, and they spread quickly. When Antarah composed verse about his situation, about his pride, about his frustration, about his love, that verse circulated among the tribes. People who had never met him knew his voice through the poems. This created a form of presence that transcended physical geography and even, eventually, time. As covered earlier, even his refusal to fight had circulated as verse, demonstrating that the poem had functioned as a weapon long before the formal declaration of his freedom.
When he warned his adversary that his verse would outlast them both and expose the other's shame to future generations, he was not simply being dramatic. He was stating a truth about how power actually worked in his world. The man who could compose could outlast the man who could only fight. A sword stroke ends. A poem continues. And for Antarah, a man who had spent his entire youth being told that the categories imposed on him from birth were his permanent condition, the possibility of speaking across time, of making an argument that would persist long after his personal circumstances had resolved or dissolved, was not an abstract literary ambition. It was the deepest form of vindication available to him. His poetry earned its place in the Mu'allakat not because of sympathy for his biography, not because the judges of the tradition made accommodations for his origins, but because the verse itself was considered among the finest the Arabic language had produced up to that point. That judgment came from people who were themselves masters of the form, who had read or heard everything the tradition preserved, and who applied criteria of genuine rigor.
His poem was selected alongside work by men of royal descent, tribal chiefs, figures whose social position made their place in the canon a more straightforward matter. Antarah's poem earned its hanging beside theirs on pure literary grounds.
And it is here that the question becomes interesting, not just for what it tells us about a 6th century warrior poet from the highlands of Najd, but for what it suggests about the relationship between difficulty and art. The obstacles that surrounded him, the slavery, the racial exclusion, the forbidden love, the years of proving himself in conditions that should never have required the proof, these were not incidental to his poetry. They were the pressures that produced it. The same compression that turns coal into diamond was working on his verse, and the poems that came out of that process had a specificity and urgency and refusal to look away that sets them apart from work composed in more comfortable circumstances. Whether any of that would have mattered at all if they had not eventually found their way to the ears of people who preserved them is the kind of question that keeps scholars and readers returning to the mystery of how certain voices from the deep past managed to survive while others vanish entirely. His survived. And what it would eventually become, not just within the Arabic tradition, but in the broader imagination of cultures that encountered his story centuries and even millennia after his death, was something that even a poet confident enough to threaten his enemies with posthumous verse could not have entirely foreseen.
Chapter 5. The Myth That Outlasted the Man.
Some time after Antarah ibn Shaddad died, somewhere around the year 608 of the Common Era, the process of transforming a man into a myth began. It is a process that happens to very few people in any era, and it almost never happens by design. It requires a particular combination of ingredients: a life remarkable enough to generate stories, a cultural tradition hungry for a certain kind of hero, and a set of circumstances that kept those stories alive long enough for them to become something larger than their origins. Antarah had all three. The man who had spent his life fighting to be recognized as fully human was about to become something beyond human, which would have struck him, one imagines, as either the ultimate vindication or a complicated irony, or quite possibly both. The first phase of this transformation happened within the oral tradition itself, during the decades and then centuries after his death, when his poems and the stories attached to his name circulated through the tribes and eventually reached the great centers of Islamic learning in Iraq. The scholars who began the serious project of recovering pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, working in places like Basra and Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries, encountered Antarah not as a historical figure with a well-documented biography, but as a semi-legendary presence. His poems existed in multiple versions and variants. Stories about his life did not always agree. Already, within roughly 2 centuries of his death, the edges of the factual had blurred considerably into the territory of the remarkable. The figure most associated with the formal collection and study of his work was al-Asma'i, a poet and philologist at the court of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad. He compiled a significant poetry anthology and was, as later generations would call him, the father of Arabic philology. Under his influence, Antarah was included among the 6 poets, the pre-Islamic voices whose work was considered essential to any understanding of the classical Arabic tradition. This was a canon-forming decision with enormous consequences. For all subsequent generations of anyone serious about Arabic literature, Antarah's poetry was not optional background reading. It was foundational material. 2 centuries after al-Asma'i, the tradition he had anchored in Baghdad traveled westward into Al-Andalus. There, 2 scholars, al-Shantamari and al-Batalyosi, composed extensive commentaries on the divans of the 6 poets, including Antarah's. Their work was an act of retransmission that planted the legend at the far western edge of the Arabic-speaking world, where it would remain within proximity of European literary culture for centuries before any formal translation crossed that boundary. Al-Asma'i is also traditionally credited, however the attribution may have shifted and been disputed over time, with beginning the long narrative work that would eventually become the Sirat Antar, the Romance of Antar. His contribution is best understood as the nucleus, a scholarly gathering of biographical tradition and verse around which later hands, over several centuries, built a vast structure. The romance took its fuller shape between the 11th and 12th centuries, its final composition anonymous, its authorship collective. What emerged was one of the most expansive pieces of narrative literature in the Arabic language. An early printing in Beirut in 1871 ran to 10 volumes. The Cairo printing of 1889 expanded to 32 volumes, built around the life of one man, a man who had begun his days watching goats in the highlands of Najd. What the romance did to the historical Antarah was both spectacular and philosophically interesting. It took the essential shape of his life, the slave origins, the warrior excellence, the forbidden love, the poetic genius, and inflated that shape to encompass everything the Arabic storytelling imagination valued and desired. The historical Antarah fought in the wars of 6th century Arabia. The legendary Antarah of the romance traveled to Iraq, Iran, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, Spain, Constantinople, Rome, and the Sudan. He encountered Byzantine emperors and Frankish kings. He became a vessel into which many centuries of Arab self-understanding poured themselves. The romance is written in what Arabic literary tradition calls saj, a form of rhymed rhythmic prose interspersed with approximately 10,000 lines of verse attributed to Antar himself. This mixture of prose narrative and embedded poetry served the story well because it gave audiences both the story and the song simultaneously. But the form was designed for a specific setting, and it was the Arab coffee house that functioned as the primary venue through which the romance remained a living thing for centuries. Traditional storytellers carried it there as their central material, alternating between prose narration and poetic recitation before live audiences in a continuous tradition that persisted well into the modern era. The coffee house was not incidental to the legend's survival. It was the mechanism by which the romance stayed performed rather than merely preserved, a distinction that matters enormously when considering why this particular story did not simply calcify into a scholarly artifact while people continued to debate its historical accuracy. The romance's importance has been compared, repeatedly and by careful observers, to the Arthurian cycle in English literature. The comparison illuminates more than it might initially seem to. Both traditions built vast mythologies of chivalric ideal around historical or semi-historical figures. Both were understood by their respective cultures as expressing something fundamental about what a hero should be. But the social position of the central figure differs in ways the comparison cannot afford to flatten. Arthur was, in the dominant versions of his legend, a king whose heroic status rested on revelation. The sword, the stone, the hidden royal lineage finally disclosed. The discovery of his identity was the story. Antar began as a slave, and the romance he inspired rested on the opposite proposition, that identity is not revealed but earned through deed after deed against a world designed to deny it. The myth that built around Arthur affirmed the established order, offering a vision of legitimacy restored to its rightful place. The myth that built around Antar interrogated the established order, insisting that legitimacy could be constructed from scratch by someone the order had categorically excluded. That is a different kind of myth, carrying different social implications. And when readers in subsequent centuries found themselves drawn to one or the other, they were gravitating toward different ideas about where worth actually comes from. The physical spread of Antarah's legend beyond the Arabic-speaking world is documented with some fascinating specificity. In 1477, by order of Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the Sirat Antar was translated into Turkish, an act commissioned by one of the most powerful rulers in the world at that moment, a man who had recently taken Constantinople.
Manuscript copies of this Turkish translation, in 3 volumes, were preserved in the Topkapi Palace Museum Library, placing the story of a desert warrior from pre-Islamic Arabia physically inside one of the great courts of the Ottoman Empire. European engagement with the story arrived in stages. The first came in 1820, when the English diplomat and Orientalist Tarik Hamilton published a partial translation of the romance in 4 volumes under the title Antarah, a Bedouin Romance, describing it as the first time the work had been submitted, even in part, to the European public. Hamilton presented the romance as something distinct from the refined literary conventions of his own culture, more elemental, more direct, a narrative of desire and combat and pride formed before the mediating customs of courtly tradition had shaped it. Whether that framing was fully accurate or inevitably filtered through his own cultural assumptions is a fair question, but the publication itself established a foothold. The legend now existed in English, available to readers who had no access to the Arabic tradition from which it came.
78 years later, the French painter Etienne Dinet published a translation of a 13th-century Arabic epic poem about Antar, extending European exposure in a different register. Diana Richmond's Antarah and Abla, published in England in the 1970s, continued the tradition. Each transmission changed something in how the story was received, filtering it through new assumptions while preserving the broad outlines of the original. Western scholarly engagement with Antarah's actual poetry had its own parallel arc. In 1870, the German philologist Wilhelm Allwart published an edition of the Divans of the 6 Poets in London, the first major scholarly presentation of Antarah's verse for a Western academic audience. It established a textual basis from which subsequent translation and commentary would proceed, and it placed his work alongside that of the other canonical pre-Islamic poets in a form European scholarship could engage with on its own terms. The Russian composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov composed his Symphony No. 2 based on the legend of Antar, a fact that carries a kind of conceptual vertiginousness when held in mind properly. A 19th-century Russian musician, working in the tradition of European classical orchestral composition, found in the story of a 6th-century Arabian warrior poet sufficient material for a major symphony. The work represents a serious artistic engagement with the emotional world of the Antarah legend, particularly its themes of love, adventure, and mortality. And its existence is a measure of how widely the story had traveled and how deeply it could resonate across distances that might have seemed prohibitive.
In the visual arts, the Lebanese painter Rafik Sharaf developed from the 1960s onward an entire series of paintings devoted to the epics of Antar and Abla, considered a cornerstone of his artistic legacy. A story does not stay alive this way through cultural obligation alone. It stays alive because artists keep finding in it something that speaks to their own moment. The 20th century brought Antarah into film and television as well. A 1961 Egyptian film titled Antarah ibn Shaddad brought the story to cinema audiences, though it was later criticized for a casting approach that failed to honor the mixed Arab and African ancestry that was central to who Antarah was. This criticism is significant rather than incidental. It points to a tension that runs through the entire history of the legend's transmission, whether the racial and social dimensions of Antarah's story can be separated from the heroic narrative without losing something essential. Beyond that single film, the story has generated multi-episode television series stretching across 30 or more episodes, suggesting that the romance's scope continues to attract adapters looking for material deep enough to sustain extended dramatic treatment. Representation across all of these remains not a footnote to his legacy, but the continuing argument of his life, conducted through different media in a different century. The first Palestinian opera, composed by Mustafa al-Kurd in 1988 and titled Antar, dramatized the legend's essential arc, the outsider's struggle against categorical exclusion, the assertion of dignity against a world of systematic denial, and was received as a pioneering cultural achievement for Palestinian music. For a people navigating questions of identity, dispossession, and the assertion of worth against determined external pressure, the choice of this particular figure was not coincidental. His story has never been simply a historical curiosity or a literary artifact. It has been, and continues to be, a resource that living communities draw on to think through their own struggles. One of the 7 clans of Bethlehem is called the Anatre, named after Antarah. In centuries past, this clan acted as guardians of the Church of the Nativity. The layers of historical time in that single fact are dizzying. His name attached itself to a Palestinian Arab clan, and that clan took on the protection of a site holy to a faith that did not exist when Antarah was born. Even in the world of heavy industry, the name found its way into unexpected territory. In the late 1940s, the British manufacturer Thornycroft designed an enormous oil field tractor intended to carry pipes for the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in the Middle East. At the time of its development, it was among the largest such vehicles in the world. The name chosen for it was the Thornycroft Mighty Antar, explicitly in reference to the warrior's strength and endurance. A 6th century poet-warrior's name on a piece of mid-20th century British heavy machinery, operating in the same general region where he had once ridden into battle. Scholarly engagement with his actual poetry continued to produce serious work into the 21st century. A comprehensive critical edition of his surviving verse, examining 5 different manuscript traditions, was published in 2018, a rigorous philological undertaking more than 14 centuries after the poems were first composed. That same year, a parallel translation brought the poems to English-speaking general readers, with a foreword by the poet Peter Cole, who described Antarah's voice as one that intones eternal truths about commitment, loyalty, and fidelity. The award-winning Canadian poet Anne Carson, writing in the New York Review of Books, was more direct about the contemporary reach. If asked for details of battle, she wrote, she would quote Antarah ibn Shaddad. The observation says something the scholarly apparatus cannot quite say on its own, that his voice has not merely survived the distance from the 6th century, but arrived. What the full arc of his afterlife demonstrates is that the myth was not simply waiting inside the man to be discovered. It was built. Al-Asma'i assembled the nucleus. The Andalusian commentators transmitted it westward. Ottoman patronage gave it a court. Hamilton gave it an English shelf. Rimsky-Korsakov gave it an orchestra. Al-Kurd gave it a stage. Each act of transmission was also an act of construction, finding in the original material whatever the new moment required. The desert warrior became a myth because people in many different times and places kept deciding, for their own reasons, that the myth was worth making. Antarah ibn Shaddad was born with everything arranged against him: his status, his skin, his mother's chains. And yet he became the standard by which Arabic poetry measures itself. The warrior whose name a Palestinian clan carries. The voice a Russian composer heard across 13 centuries of silence. His life argues something uncomfortable and important: that systems of exclusion do not reform through conscience. They yield only when the cost of holding becomes greater than the cost of releasing. What he built from that yielding, in verse, in battle, in love that refused its own impossibility, endured precisely because it was made under pressure. The difficulty was not incidental, it was the forge. 15 centuries after he first addressed an empty dwelling where Abla once lived, his words are still arriving. Perhaps the deepest question his story leaves us with is this: how many voices like his never found their moment? Thank you for listening.